I'm Anthony Jewett from St. Mary's in Park City, and this is Rejoice in Hope, an audio series on discovering Jesus Christ. In May of 1945, as the Second World War was ending, many German soldiers began to defect from their units when they realized the war was lost. It was an incredibly risky move. Defecting from your duties as a soldier in the German army was punishable by death, and if you were caught by enemy forces, you were certainly either going to be imprisoned or killed. One young man, only 18 years old at the time, decided to return home rather than keep fighting. Despite coming from a family of devout Catholics and anti-Nazis, he was forced to enlist in the Hitler Youth at the age of 14 and served as a soldier in training. His entire adolescence was defined by this war, and now he had finally had enough. As he walked home, he was stopped by two SS officers whose responsibilities included shooting any deserters on the spot. In a moment of coincidence, maybe serendipity, or maybe even fate, the soldiers looked at this young man with his arm in a sling from an injury and told him to go home. He was injured. He recalled this moment, and he said, "Thank God that they too had had their fill of the war, and they did not want to become murderers." It turns out that this was actually a crucial moment in human history. The young man's name was Joseph Ratzinger, and he later went on to become Pope Benedict XVI. Ratzinger joined the priesthood right after this and became one of the most trusted theologians of the church, and eventually led the global community for 8 years as the Vicar of Christ. Human history is made up of stories just like this. How would the world be altered if those two soldiers carried out their duties and killed the young Joseph Ratzinger? How much of our studying major historical events, like World War II, takes into account the very human stories of people like this? This is something we need to be aware of. Human history is made up of humans, each unique in their personality, their emotions, their behavior. This is also true of the history of Jesus Christ. In this series, we're trying to find ways in which we can look deeper into the person of Jesus Christ in order to get to know him and to establish a relationship with him. The best way to initiate that process is by trying to find out who he was in history. One of the ways we might be able to understand the historical Jesus is by looking at the Gospels. After all, they're essentially the most detailed sources we have today of the events in the life of Christ. But how much can we trust that they're actually historical? As a trained theologian, Pope Benedict was highly skilled in dissecting texts like the Gospels in order to get to a deeper meaning. But like all Catholics, what Benedict was really after, in his own words, was a personal search for the face of the Lord. His faith is what allowed him to persevere in the war. Jesus Christ was the person that gave his life hope when the situation was dire and hopeless. Early on in his papacy, Benedict wrote a book trying to find a way of better understanding Christ, and he titled it Jesus of Nazareth. It's become a respected book for those trying to understand Jesus in a more personal, realistic way, and I highly recommend it. But one of the main claims that Benedict makes, with all of the intense research and prayer that went into this work, is that the Jesus Christ we find in the Gospels is in fact the Jesus of history. It seems to be a common opinion today that the Church's understanding of Jesus Christ was gradual, and it took us a while after his resurrection and ascension for us to understand exactly who he was. But how long did it actually take until people fully understood the identity of Christ? In his letter to the Philippians, Paul recites a formulated statement on the complete identity of Jesus Christ, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God something to be grasped. Rather, he emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, coming in human likeness. and found human in appearance, he humbled himself, becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Because of this, God greatly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bend, of those in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. This was written only 20 years after Christ. So we should note that we had a complete understanding of Christ's identity at least within 20 years of his time on earth. But we should also ask ourselves, what was happening during that time? We're going to be using the Gospels to understand the history of Christ because they are our most reliable source. But we can't dissect the Gospels in the way we tend to do with other historical sources. Once we separate our faith from our studies, which we think is necessary in studying history, we start grasping at straws trying to fit the extraordinary within our concept of the ordinary. If we put aside our faith and focus on the quote-unquote objective facts, we disregard the stories of his miracles and his resurrection. And those things are way too important not to focus on. History is really a study of human beings, and humans are complex. We can't access the innermost being of the writers of the gospel, but these were the ones who tell us of these miraculous events as they experienced them and through their own interpretations. If we want to be fair and honest in our curiosity of historic events, we need to sympathize and become almost congenial with the figures we study, because it's through their minds that we access the stories of the past. A big problem with trying to understand the events of the past is that we need to understand the people involved. And a person can really only be studied in their entirety after they die. When they die, we might be able to get a complete picture of their entire life, but not through their eyes. Communication with that person is cut off forever at the moment they die. But if this person was to rise from the dead and explain to us their life in the context of its beginning, middle, and end, we would need to reevaluate their entire life. Because we encounter Jesus after his death in the Gospels, we're only able to speak of his previous life in the context of his resurrection, which completely blows open the door to understanding the complexity of him. In order to understand any single historical event, there are a ton of details that need to be taken into account. We need to look at the event itself. We need to look at the background and motivation of those involved. We need to look at the things that led up to the event. All of this, and because of this, trying to understand history is impossible without also trying to understand meaning. If we think studying Jesus historically will allow us to understand him better, it would only work if we tried to approach his history with those sciences that pursue meaning, like theology or philosophy. So in other words, we're trying to understand the meaning of Christ's life and how it relates to the meaning of our place in history. Once we approach the Gospels in this way, they start to become trustworthy historical sources that reveal to us that God is acting in Jesus. And the story of Jesus is unlike any other person's story in human history. Remember, we can only get an accurate assessment of a historical figure by sympathizing with them and becoming congenial with them. And that's exactly what the Gospels do. They make Jesus congenial and approachable, while at the same time giving us the context of his earthly life through what was revealed by him after his death. No secrets were buried with Christ. In every act and word of Jesus, God is actively communicating with us, and that communication constantly reveals new things every time we open a passage from the Gospels. Those who wrote them understood this. So, what was happening in those 20 years before Paul wrote accurately about Christ's identity to the Philippians? The Christian community was collecting memories and accounts of those moments in Jesus' life that gave meaning to the community. This is where the Gospels came from, and this is how we can also understand the epistles of the New Testament. The early church seemed to value the diversity of perspectives on the meaningful moments of Jesus' life over a highly processed, unapproachable, quote-unquote, historical biography. The Gospels made Jesus a human being that we can get to know personally. The Jesus of the Gospels is the Jesus of history. This is the way we understand him. This is the way we establish a relationship with him in order to ultimately understand God's plan for us and his presence in our own history.